Made possible through support from the Arc of Aurora, Arc Thrift Stores, Aurora Victim Witness Advisory Board, CCDC, Colorado Cross Disability Coalition, Colorado District Attorneys Council, and Developmental Pathways. A Think Change training.
Hi, my name is Hani Rayleigh. I am the Assistant Executive Director here with the Arc of Aurora, filming something special for you guys today for Think Change. I'm here with Dr. Scott Modell, a national and acclaimed expert in really all things IDD, but you can tell us more later. And of course, I will link his bio in our show notes. But I wanted to get together with Scott and talk a little bit about forensic interviewing as it relates to people with intellectual and developmental disabilities.
Sure.
But before we get going, you want to give us a short little summary of who you are and...
Oh, you said it. I'm Scott. Scott Modell. I consult full-time, but specifically to the area of forensic interviewing. Worked with multiple jurisdictions across the United States and in other countries on forensic interviewing, specifically focusing on forensic interviewing individuals with disabilities and also adults with disabilities, not just children, and kind of what some of those nuances are.
Oh, great. Well, thank you. Tell us a little bit about what is forensic interviewing?
Sure. Yeah. So forensic interviewing is a structured interview process, and people are trained to do it. Nationally, there isn't one set standard model. There's multiple models, and lots of people have been trained in what we call mixed modality or mixed methods, where they have training from different forensic interviewing programs. But basically, it's designed to get information in the most reliable, legally defensible way from... was originally designed for children, from alleged victims of, and mostly it would be physical abuse sexual abuse or severe physical abuse. And so people are trained to conduct these interviews. They are required to stay current in research, required to have what's called peer reviews, so somebody to watch their interviews to make sure that they're staying true to the model. But essentially it's training to ensure that we are gathering information in a non-leading, so most reliable and legally defensible way.
Great. And how does forensic interviewing differ from, let's say, children to adults with IDD or kiddos with IDD? Does it differ?
Sure. So currently, individuals with disabilities over the age of 18, there's some variation across the country. Sometimes they are served in a child advocacy center where they'll have the interview conducted there. Currently, there's no place that does it. There's no adult advocacy center that exists.
Okay.
So what's different? There's a couple things that are different. One of the other functions of when a child gets a forensic interview, specifically at a child advocacy center, is there are services there to address any trauma that the child has. So that would be a difference that an adult with a disability, age appropriate and disability appropriate services to treat any trauma from the experience is necessary. What's also different is issues of consent. So if you have an adult so by the very nature of being a child, children cannot give consent to sexual behavior.
Of course.
So when we have adults are assumed to be able to give consent unless there's a concern that they're... Right, exactly. So that is different. But mainly I would say that this sort of age appropriateness child advocacy centers are child-centered and directed at children, and they do an incredible job. So when we have adults, it's not as necessarily age-appropriate, and specifically when we're dealing with individuals with disabilities, conducting some of those forensic interviews can be challenging if we're talking about people with limited vocabulary or other behaviors that may make it very difficult to conduct this interview in a legally defensible, reliable way.
Absolutely. And so could the same interviewer that interviews a child be able to interview an adult, let's say, with intellectual and developmental disabilities?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So, like everything, it depends. because there are some forensic interviewers who are fantastic. And in fact, as we continue to ensure that more adult victims with disabilities are getting justice,
Sure.
part of that would be getting a reliable forensic interview. Those are the pools of people that were probably best suited to conduct those interviews.
Yeah.
Ideally, they would have some additional training on disability and understanding disability and some strategies. One of the most complex interviews to do is to interview somebody in a reliable way who doesn't speak, who may only use gestures for yes or no or some sort of communication device. That increases the complexity
Sure.
of some of the interviews. The other thing that increases the complexity of some of the interviews for adults with disabilities is depending on the individual's need. As you know, some adults don't need any assistance with activities of daily living, while others need help toileting or bathing. That starts to increase the complexity of body safety assessments about appropriate and inappropriate touching and so forth.
Sure, sure. And so if let's say a children's advocacy center doesn't necessarily have someone specifically dedicated to providing interviews for individuals and adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities, are there some like best practices that an interviewer might consider to be able to, get the best and most thorough interview from that individual?
Yeah, really great question. So I would say sound forensic interviewing principles hold true regardless of the person that you're interviewing.
Okay.
The strategy would be, if the individual with a disability, because as you know, some individuals with disabilities communicate exactly like we're communicating right now.
Sure.
But if there is a nuance in how they communicate, or there's some specific way accessing that information on the front end.
Sure.
If an individual takes medication, if they are behavior needs, recognizing maybe what time of day might be the best day to conduct the interview, or
Sure.
if they do take medication, making sure they take their medication, or if they have sensory issues, being aware of any sensory needs in the room. So gathering a lot of information on the front end can be incredibly helpful.
And so as a support individual to someone with IDD or other disabilities, it would be best practice for me to be able to provide that information to the interviewer so that they have a good idea who the individual is, their kind of care needs, or
Yes.
would that potentially interfere with the interview?
The first thing I would say is, if someone as an advocate or caregiver discloses to you that they've been physically or sexually abused, believe them.
Yeah.
And then if it does get to a point where they are going to engage in a forensic interview or some type of interview with law enforcement or some social service agency, providing on the front end as much information about the person's needs, how they communicate, to ensure as a successful interview as possible. Because remember, the goal is reliable information, and sometimes reliable information means that a crime did not occur.
Sure.
So it's really about, and then I would say another key piece is, even if we can't establish that or aren't sure if something happened, we can still gather reliable information from a forensic interview that will inform safety, that may inform safety planning and
Sure.
so forth.
Afterwards. Excellent. And so are there any, from an advocacy point of view, if we know that there perhaps is something that might go to trial or might get pushed further down the kind of judicial trajectory, is there anything that we would need from that interview to be able to help with specific cases or specific kind of direction of the issue? Does that make sense?
So when you say we, so yeah.
I would say from like an advocate's perspective,
I would,
or a family member's
yeah.
perspective.
So what I would say is we'll walk through a scenario where there's a disclosure that there was some type of abuse. A forensic interview was conducted. The result of the interview is that we believe a crime has been committed.
Sure.
And as it heads down that sort of prosecutorial path, there's nothing really the advocates need to do about the interview. What the advocates want to do is make sure that the person is safe, and that any of their needs in terms of responding to their trauma needs are met.
Sure.
And one of the gold standard for trauma treatment is what's called TFCBT, trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy.
Okay.
There are others. That's
Sure.
not the only one. But trying to get someone connected to services after a traumatic experience is really
That's
important.
important. Excellent. Are the interviews videotaped?
So, great question. Depending on the jurisdiction, most interviews are across the country.
Sure.
Some areas of the country, they don't record it or memorialize it with video
Sure.
and audio. There are arguments for both. I think a lot. A general consensus is memorializing a forensic interview, both video and audio, is best. But there are jurisdictions and are some arguments against that. My preference would be, and I would be in favor of memorializing through video and audio.
Great. Well, I know in Colorado, we those videos could be considered admissible in courts.
Yes, based
but-
on your legislation.
Absolutely, but that is pretty individual to the case and the individual that's a victim. So it's just interesting information to have both in Colorado as well as nationally
Sure,
how that interview could be used.
absolutely.
Is there anything else we should know about forensic interviewing as it relates to people with intellectual disabilities? Is there special access to forensic interviewing that perhaps from an advocacy point of view, if it's not indicated otherwise to get a forensic interview, are there pathways that for advocates or family members could take to get more information regarding a trauma?
So yeah, I mean, what currently exists now in Colorado, I don't have a full sense of everything that's available, but the Child Advocacy Network generally has a pretty good handle on a lot of those services. Some are starting to adapt services to individuals with disabilities. So it would be, I think the Child Advocacy Center would be a place to go. And I think the main thing that people should know is so many times crimes are committed against people with disabilities, and we don't get to the phase of somebody trying to engage them in the process through a forensic interview.
Yeah.
And there's several reasons for this, but we need to push this more and more because we want to make sure that a group of individuals that we know statistically are much more likely to experience violent victimization and serious violent victimization, we want to do the best we can and one, believe when people tell us things, and then also get the right interview and the right services so that they're not stuck in this trauma state and re-victimized.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Scott, for making yourself available for me,
Thanks for having me.
Aurora, and for all the Think Change viewers and or listeners. Stay tuned to our next series and stay in touch.